918. I want you to sit with that number for a second. 918. It's a number that feels so abstract, almost like a statistic from a history book, you know?
It just doesn't feel real.
It doesn't. But if you try to visualize it, I mean, that is a small town. That is a completely packed high school gymnasium. That's a line of people stretching for blocks and blocks.
And on November 18th, 1978, every single one of those lives was just extinguished. It remains, to this day, the largest loss of American civilian life in a non-natural disaster, with the sole exception of September 11th.
And yet, and this is the thing that really drove me crazy while we were prepping for this deep dive, culturally, we have reduced this massive, complex tragedy to a punchline, a meme.
Oh, absolutely.
We've all heard it. I'm sure we've all probably said it at some point, you know, in a business meeting or a political argument. Oh, don't drink the Kool-Aid.
It's just become shorthand, hasn't it? It means don't blindly follow a bad idea or, you know, watch out for corporate groupthink.
Exactly. But when you actually open the files on the People's Temple Agricultural Project, which is the official name for Jonestown, you realize that phrase isn't just disrespectful. It's actually a complete lie. It completely rewrites history.
It does. And look, let's just get the pedantic fact check out of the way right now so we don't have to dwell on it.
Right.
It wasn't Kool-Aid. The forensic evidence from the scene, the empty boxes littering the pavilion, they were for Flavor Aid, a cheaper off-brand competitor.
Trivial detail, really.
It is. But the much more important correction, and this is the one we are going to spend the next hour unpacking, is the idea that this was a mass suicide.
Right. Because that word suicide, it implies a choice, doesn't it? It implies willingness. And what we're going to see, what the evidence just overwhelmingly shows, is that for a huge percentage of those 918 people,
hundreds,
the babies, the toddlers, the seniors, and the people staring down the barrel of a rifle, choice had absolutely nothing to do with it.
That's the mission today. We need to dismantle that myth, the myth of their crazy cult that killed themselves, and instead look at the machinery of how this happened. Because Jonestown didn't just appear out of thin air in a jungle in Guyana.
No.
It didn't start with crazy people. It started in the heart of the American political establishment.
That's the part that just completely blew my mind in the research. The question I kept writing in the margins of all these notes was just how? How do you go from being this politically connected, progressive, racially integrated church group in San Francisco? I mean, these people were dining with vice presidents. How do you go from that to dead in the mud in South America?
It is a terrifying slide. And it's not a straight line. It's not one single event. It's a study in isolation, in political radicalism, and the slow creeping psychology of total control.
So let's start there. Let's start not in the jungle, but in the city, because I think most people have this image of Jim Jones as this fringe lunatic, you know, a guy in sunglasses shouting on a street corner somewhere.
Right, a classic cult leader archetype.
But the source material, it paints a completely different picture of him in the mid-1970s.
Oh, completely. If you were living in San Francisco in, say, 1975 and 1976, Jim Jones wasn't a fringe lunatic. He was a power broker. He was, in many ways, the establishment.
So the People's Temple, it started in Indiana back in the 50s, but they moved to California in 65. Is that when they started gaining this political influence?
That's when it really ramped up. When they established themselves in San Francisco, they became a machine, a political machine.
Let's drill down into that machine aspect, because our notes say he was instrumental in the mayoral election of George Moscone. How does a preacher become instrumental in a major city's mayoral race?
It comes down to one thing: bodies. The People's Temple didn't just have a congregation. They had a mobilized, incredibly disciplined voting bloc. Jones could snap his fingers and have thousands of volunteers walking precincts, handing out flyers.
Getting out the vote.
Getting out the vote, which is the most important thing. And in a tight local election, which that one was, that is pure gold. Moscone won that election by a very, very slim margin.
And he knew who to thank.
He knew exactly who tipped the scales. And he was grateful.
He knew it enough to give Jones a job. And we're not talking about some, you know, ceremonial thank you position.
No. This was a serious appointment. This was real power. Mayor Moscone appointed Jim Jones as the chairman of the San Francisco Housing Authority.
Stop and think about that for a second. The man who would later orchestrate the Jonestown massacre was the chairman of the Housing Authority for a major American city.
He was in charge of public housing. He was leading public meetings. He was deciding the fate of tenants and multi-million-dollar budgets.
And if you look at the records from those meetings, he was already practicing his methods of control, wasn't he?
It was pure theater. Jones would pack the meeting room with hundreds of temple members. If he made a motion, the room would erupt in cheers. If someone dared to oppose him, the room would boo them into silence. He was basically road testing his control tactics on a municipal level.
And his network, it went way beyond the mayor's office. I'm looking at some of the names here in the source material. And, well, they're icons of the Democratic Party. Walter Mondale, Rosalind Carter.
It's absolutely true. In September of 1976, there was this massive testimonial dinner held in Jones's honor. The guest list was a who's who of California and national politics.
He was there.
Governor Jerry Brown was there. Assemblyman Willie Brown, who was arguably the most powerful politician in the entire state, he was there. And he famously compared Jones to Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi.
Wow.
Walter Mondale, who was running for vice president at the time, said a glowing endorsement that was read aloud. Rosalind Carter, the future First Lady, actively campaigned with him. She shared a stage with him.
Why? I mean, looking back now with the benefit of hindsight, it seems completely insane. Did they not see the cracks? Were there no warning signs?
You have to look at what Jones was selling on the surface. He wasn't selling "come join my crazy cult." He was selling racial integration and social justice.
The optics were good.
The optics were fantastic. The People's Temple was one of the few truly integrated organizations at the time. You had young white college kids sitting next to elderly African-American women. You had professionals, laborers all together. To a progressive politician in the 70s, that looked like the dream coalition. Jones was a master at hiding the abuse behind this shield of progressive politics.
He had a whole PR team, right? The notes mention public relations women.
Yes. He had a dedicated team within the temple whose entire job was to polish the image and manage the narrative. They courted the press. They courted politicians. They made sure that whenever any dignitaries visited one of their facilities, all they saw were happy children singing and a vibrant, productive community. They were incredibly aggressive about managing the narrative.
Okay, so he's the king of San Francisco. He's got the mayor on speed dial. He's got the future first lady singing his praises. Which brings us back to that central question. Why leave? Why pack up 1,000 people and move them to a remote, undeveloped jungle in Guyana?
It's that classic push and pull dynamic. The pull was that Jones was a malignant narcissist who wanted total, absolute dominion. In San Francisco, for all his power, he still had to deal with laws. He had to deal with the press, with critics, with defectors. He wanted a kingdom where his word was the only law. Guyana offered that possibility.
Why Guyana specifically, though? Was it just a random spot on the map?
Not at all. It was very, very calculated. The source material breaks down the reasoning really clearly. First, it's English-speaking.
That's huge.
It's huge. If you're moving hundreds of Americans, you don't have to deal with an immediate language barrier. Second, Guyana had a socialist government at the time, led by Prime Minister Forbes Burnham. Jones could pitch his project as a sort of socialist fellow traveler experiment.
So he's speaking their language politically.
Exactly. And third, and this was absolutely crucial for his followers, Guyana had a predominantly black leadership.
Right, because the demographics of the temple were, what, about 70% African-American?
Yeah. Roughly 70% of Jonestown's population was black. And Jones sold Guyana to them as a sanctuary. He hammered this message home constantly. The U.S. is racist. The U.S. is going to put you in concentration camps. A race war is coming. In Guyana, a black-led socialist country, you will finally be free.
It's a powerful pitch.
It's an incredibly powerful pitch if you've experienced racism in America.
Okay.
But he was also pitching the Guyanese government, right? He had to get their permission to bring 1,000 Americans into their country and set up shop.
And that's where his manipulative genius comes in again. He didn't just go to them and say, we want to start a farm. He looked at the map. He was clever.
He was. The spot they chose was in the deep interior, in the northwest of the country, right near the border with Venezuela. Now, Guyana and Venezuela have had this long-standing, very contentious border dispute for over a century. Venezuela claims that entire chunk of territory.
So Jones saw a geopolitical angle.
He did. He went to Prime Minister Forbes Burnham and basically said, let me put 1,000 American citizens right on your disputed border. We will be a human buffer zone. Venezuela will never dare to invade if they know they have to run over American citizens to do it.
That is just, it's chilling. He's literally using his own followers as human shields, as a bargaining chip to get land.
They were always just tools to him. He used them as a voting bloc in San Francisco, and he used them as a geopolitical buffer in Guyana. They were pawns.
So that's the pull, the allure of a private kingdom. What was the push? Because the move wasn't a slow, organized trickle. At a certain point, it turned into a panic.
The push was the press. Despite all his political connections, all his PR work, rumors were leaking out. Defectors were starting to talk to journalists about the beatings, about the forced confessions, about financial fraud. And in the summer of 1977, a publication called New West Magazine was preparing to publish a massive expose.
This is the Marshall Kilduff article.
That's the one. And back then, there was sometimes this professional courtesy where editors would read the article to the subject before publication, for fact-checking.
A courtesy that doesn't exist anymore.
Not so much. An editor from the magazine read the article to Jones over the phone. Jones listened to all these detailed allegations of physical abuse, of financial crimes. He hung up the phone, and he decided to run. He fled to Guyana that very night.
Just like that.
Gone. And the great exodus began. Hundreds of his followers were ordered to follow him over the next few months. They left their jobs, they sold their homes, they signed over their life savings to the temple, said goodbye to their families, and they flew to South America.
They thought they were building a socialist paradise.
They did. That was a promise.
So let's talk about that paradise. Because the brochure, I'm sure, was beautiful. The People's Temple Agricultural Project, it sounds noble, it sounds like a Peace Corps mission. But the reality, let's unpack the reality of day-to-day life inside Jonestown.
It was a bait-and-switch operation of the absolute highest order. The brochure promised a tropical utopia, self-sufficiency, brotherhood, racial harmony. The reality was a poorly run, overcrowded labor camp.
Let's start with the physical conditions. What are we talking about?
Well, start with the environment itself. It's the jungle. It is incredibly hot. It is relentlessly humid, and the soil is terrible. This is something that often gets overlooked in the story.
Hey, they're an agricultural project. The soil is kind of important.
You would think. But the soil in that region is a low fertility clay. It's just not meant for the kind of intensive agriculture they were attempting. They couldn't grow enough food. They were never going to be self-sufficient.
So they were hungry.
They were starving. We have menus and survivor accounts that are just heartbreaking. The average diet was rice for breakfast, maybe some rice water for lunch, and then rice with some boiled greens or beans for dinner. If you were extremely lucky, you might get an egg.
And on this diet, they were working. How long?
11-plus-hour days. 6:30 in the morning to 6:00 at night, 6 days a week. Chopping wood, clearing fields in that sweltering heat, all on a massive calorie deficit. People were fainting in the fields from malnutrition.
But not everyone was starving, right? I remember reading a very specific detail about Jim Jones's personal cottage.
No, the king was not starving. Jones lived in a cottage that looked modest from the outside, but inside he had a refrigerator.
Yeah.
And that refrigerator was stocked with soda, with meat, with eggs. So while his followers are literally collapsing from hunger, he's in his air-conditioned room drinking a cold Coke and eating a steak.
That hypocrisy is just infuriating. But it also serves a purpose in the control system, doesn't it? It establishes him as a different species. He's the leader. He deserves the protein. You are the worker. You deserve the rice.
It reinforces the hierarchy perfectly, but the physical hardship, the hunger, the exhaustion, that was just one layer of the control. The psychological control was arguably even more intense. We have to talk about the loudspeaker.
The
tower. Jones installed this massive PA system that covered the entire settlement, every cabin, every field, and he was on it. Constantly. Survivors talk about this with genuine trauma in their voices. You would wake up to his voice. You would work all day to his voice. You would eat your meager dinner to his voice. He would be ranting, reading the news, giving orders, sometimes rambling incoherently deep into the night.
You could never escape it. You couldn't turn it off.
There was no off switch.
Yeah.
It's a classic brainwashing technique. If you bombard the human brain with constant noise and information, and you couple that with sleep deprivation and malnutrition, it becomes nearly impossible to form an independent thought. You were just a vessel for the leader's voice.
And the information he was feeding them through that speaker was, well, let's call it curated.
It was terrifyingly curated. You have to remember, they have no TV, no radio from the outside world, no newspapers. Their mail is completely censored, both outgoing and incoming, so Jim Jones is their only window to the world. And he painted the world outside as a complete and utter hellscape.
What kind of stuff was he telling them?
He would read news reports, but they were often from Soviet outlets like DSS or from Radio Havana. He would spin everything. He told them that the Ku Klux Klan was marching openly in the streets of every American city. He told them the U.S. government had finally started rounding up African Americans and putting them in concentration camps.
Which was a fear he'd been stoking for years.
For years. He told them that society back home had collapsed into fascism. So if
Yeah.
you're sitting in the jungle, you're exhausted, you're hungry, and the only voice you ever hear is telling you that your home is burning to the ground, you believe it. You have no way to fact-check any of it.
It creates that perfect siege mentality. We can't go back. Because there is nothing to go back to. This jungle is the only safe place left on Earth.
Precisely. And to reinforce that paranoia, they had movie nights, but they weren't watching comedies.
No.
Jones curated the film selection very carefully. They watched the Parallax View, they watched the Costa Gavras film Z, they watched The Day of the Jackal.
These are all dense, paranoid political thrillers about assassinations, government conspiracies, shadowy cabals.
Exactly. He was using popular entertainment to validate his paranoid worldview. He'd say, see? Even the movies admit it. The government is out to get us. The CIA is everywhere.
So you're exhausted, you're terrified of the outside world, you're constantly listening to his voice. But what if you still stepped out of line? What if you complained about the food? Or fell asleep during one of his late-night rants?
Then you would meet the discipline system. There was no jail in Jonestown. They had something far worse. They had the box.
Can you describe the box?
It was a plywood container, roughly 6 feet long by 4 feet wide by 3 feet high. Barely big enough for a person to cram themselves into. It was buried partially underground to keep it stable. If you misbehaved, you were locked inside.
It's basically a coffin.
It's a coffin. And in the tropical heat, it would become an oven. Total darkness, sensory deprivation, heat exhaustion, insects. People were kept in there for hours, sometimes days.
And that was for the adults. The notes mention something even more disturbing called the well for children.
This is one of the hardest things to even read about. If children misbehaved, and misbehave could mean anything from stealing a cookie to not paying attention, they would sometimes be taken to the settlement's main well in the middle of the night.
And what happened there?
They would be dangled by a rope down into the dark shaft, sometimes upside down. Imagine the absolute terror of a child spinning in the dark, thinking they're going to be dropped into the water below. It's pure psychological torture.
It is. There's no other word for it. It's systemic torture designed to break the will.
It is. And for the people who couldn't be broken by the box, or the ones who kept resisting, there was the extended care unit.
Which sounds so benign. It sounds like a hospital wing.
It was a sedation ward.
Yeah.
The medical team in Jonestown, which, and this is important, included actual doctors and nurses who had been radicalized by Jones, used powerful psychiatric drugs as weapons. Thorazine, sodium pentothal, Demerol.
What would they do with them?
If someone was a problem case, or was caught talking about wanting to leave, they would be forcibly injected and drugged into a stupor. They called it giving them special care. But it was a chemical lobotomy. It was a way to silence dissent without leaving marks.
So we have the physical control, the information control, and the punishment. But this brings us to the most famous, or maybe the most infamous, part of the Jonestown mythology. The rehearsals, the White Knights.
This is where the story pivots. It shifts from a dystopian labor camp into an active death cult. And it seems to correspond with Jones's own decline. His health was failing. He was abusing drugs himself, a cocktail of uppers to preach for hours and downers to sleep. He was claiming he had lung cancer, which the autopsy later proved was a complete lie.
And his paranoia was just spiraling.
Completely off the charts. He was utterly convinced the CIA was coming, that mercenaries hired by his enemies were hiding in the trees waiting to attack.
So he started the drills.
The White Knights. It would happen at any time, usually deep in the night. The sirens would start wailing across the compound. Alert! 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 The entire community, all 900 people, from the toddlers to the elderly, would have to wake up immediately, run to the central pavilion, and line up.
And armed guards were there. This wasn't a fire drill.
No. The Red Brigade, which was his personal security force, would surround the pavilion with rifles and crossbows. Jones would get on the microphone and tell them that the mercenaries were in the trees. He would paint this terrifying picture. They're coming to kill us. They're coming to torture the babies.
And he gave them choices, right? The outline says it wasn't always suicide immediately.
In the early drills, he usually offered 4 options. Option 1, fleeing to the Soviet Union, which was a logistical fantasy, but it sounds like a plan. Option 2, stay and fight to the death. Option 3, flee into the jungle, which everyone knew meant certain death by snakebite or exposure. Or Option 4, revolutionary suicide.
And they practiced it. They actually went through the motions.
They did.
Yeah.
We have these chilling accounts from defectors like Deborah Layton. Jones would have his staff bring out a vat of liquid. He would get on the mic and announce, "This is poison. Tonight is the night we will die with dignity." He would tell them they had 45 minutes to live, and then everyone would be ordered to line up and drink it.
Can you imagine that psychological space? Believing you have just willingly drunk poison, holding your child, and just counting down the minutes to your own death.
And then when 45 minutes had passed and no one had died, Jones would laugh. He would get back on the microphone and say, "This was a loyalty test. I needed to see if you were ready to lay down your lives for our cause."
It's not just a test, though. It's conditioning, isn't it?
It's absolutely conditioning. It's desensitization. If you go through a mock execution 10 times, by the 11th time, you are numb to it. You've already accepted the concept of your own death. You stop fighting the idea.
There was one particular siege, though, that was more than just a drill. It lasted for days. The 6-day siege.
That's right. This was in September of 1977. It was sparked by a custody battle back in the U.S. over a young boy named John Victor Stone. Jones claimed he was the biological father. The mother and her estranged husband wanted the child back. Jones was terrified the Guyanese courts would side with the parents and force him to hand the boy over.
So he manufactured a crisis to prevent that?
He manufactured a full-blown crisis. He had one of his loyalists fire a rifle in the jungle, and then he claimed it was a sniper attack on him. He announced that mercenaries hired by the Stone family were surrounding the camp. For 6 days and 6 nights, the entire community was on lockdown. People armed with machetes and farm tools patrolled the perimeter, staring into the dark jungle, waiting for an enemy that didn't exist.
It just cements that us versus them narrative. The world wants to destroy us, so we must be ready to die for our beliefs.
Exactly.
But there's this weird subplot here that I honestly didn't know much about until we really dug into these sources. The Soviet connection. They weren't just looking at the jungle for enemies, they were looking east, to Russia.
It's one of those bizarre aspects of the whole story, but yes. The People's Temple was actively and seriously negotiating with the Soviet Union to move the entire community, all 900 people, to Russia.
He was pivoting his whole ideology.
He was. He went from Guyana is our socialist paradise to Guyana is unsafe, the imperialists have found us, our true spiritual motherland is the USSR.
And they were actually learning Russian in the middle of the jungle.
They were. There were mandatory Russian language classes in Jonestown. They studied the Soviet Constitution. They had actual visits from Soviet diplomats. Fyodor Timofeyev, who was the Soviet consul in Guyana, came to Jonestown in October 1978, just a month before the end. Jones gave speeches declaring the USSR their spiritual motherland.
It adds this strange layer of almost hope, doesn't it? Like maybe some of the people there thought, okay, this is hell, but if we just hold on a little longer, we're going to Moscow.
I think it absolutely served that purpose. It kept people compliant. Just endure this a little longer and we'll be safe behind the Iron Curtain. But time ran out because in November of 1978, the outside world finally came knocking on the door.
Enter Congressman Leo Ryan.
Leo Ryan, a Democrat from California representing a district near San Francisco. He was a real maverick. He was the kind of guy who, when he wanted to investigate prison conditions, he had himself secretly locked up in Folsom Prison for a week.
He didn't rely on reports. He went to the source.
He wanted to see things with his own eyes. And he had been hearing from this group called the Concerned Relatives.
Right. This was a group of families back in the Bay Area who were terrified for their loved ones. They were getting these censored letters or no letters at all. They were hearing stories from the few who had managed to escape.
They showed him the affidavits, the letters, everything. And Ryan decided he was going to Guyana to investigate.
And he didn't go quietly. This wasn't some secret fact-finding mission.
No, he brought the heat. He brought reporters from NBC, from the Washington Post, from the San Francisco Examiner, and he brought some of the Concerned Relatives with him. His plan was to shine a massive spotlight on Jonestown.
So November 17th, 1978, they land at the small airstrip in Port Kaituma, which is the closest town. Jones, through his lawyers, initially tries to block them, but eventually he realizes he has to let them in. What happens when the congressman finally walks into Jonestown?
At first, it's a party. Jones knows he has to play the game. He puts on a big show. That evening, there's a musical performance in the pavilion. The Jonestown Express, their house band, plays. People are singing, dancing. The guests are given the best meal anyone in Jonestown had seen in months.
So on the surface, it looks like the paradise he always promised.
On the surface, yes. But the reporters, they were trained observers. They noticed things. They noticed that people's eyes looked glazed. They noticed that whenever they tried to ask someone a question, the person would kind of glance over at Jones before answering.
And Jones himself, he was unraveling.
He was. There are audio recordings of his interviews with the press that night. He's sweating profusely, he's slurring his words, he's going off on these long, rambling rants about conspiracies. He looks and sounds like a man on the absolute edge of a cliff.
And then the next day, the entire facade just cracks wide open,
Yeah.
and it happens with a simple note.
It does. A temple member named Vern Gosney. He sees his chance. He discreetly tries to pass a small, crumpled piece of paper to Don Harris, the NBC reporter.
A huge risk.
A life or death risk. The note has two names on it, Vern Gosney and Monica Bagby. And the message is simple and desperate. Please help us get out of Jonestown.
That's the smoking gun. That proves it.
It proves that people are being held against their will. Jackie Spire, who was a young aide to Congressman Ryan at the time, and who survived the attack and went on to become a congresswoman herself, she said the entire mood shifted instantly. They knew at that moment that something was very, very wrong.
So Ryan confronts Jones. He says, "People here want to leave with me."
And surprisingly, Jones tries to bluff his way through it. He says, fine, anyone who wants to go can go. He probably thought no one would dare. But then people start standing up, the Parks family, the Bogue family. They start grabbing their children and walking toward the congressman's truck. In total, about 16 people decide to leave.
And Jones is just watching this happen, watching his authority crumble in real time.
He's watching his control evaporate before his very eyes. And to a malignant narcissist like him, this is the ultimate death. He's sitting there in the pavilion and witnesses heard him muttering, "I have failed. All is lost." He views a dozen people leaving as the total and complete destruction of his entire world. And if his world ends, then everyone's world has to end.
So the group leaves. They get on the trucks to head back to the airstrip. Ryan, the journalists, the defectors, they must have thought they'd made it. They must have felt such relief.
But Jones had already given the order. He sends the Red Brigade, his most loyal security team, after them on a tractor trailer. And he plays one last devastating trick. He sends a mole, a man named Larry Layton.
Larry Layton pretends to be a defector. He begs to go with them, and he gets on one of the planes.
So now we are at the airstrip in Port Kaituma. It's late afternoon. There are two planes waiting on the tarmac, a small 6-seat Cessna and a larger 19-seat Twin Otter. The group is rushing to board. Larry Layton gets into the Cessna. As the engine starts to rev, he pulls out a handgun that he had hidden and starts shooting the passengers inside that small plane.
And at the exact same time, the tractor arrives at the other plane.
The tractor trailer pulls up right beside the Twin Otter. The men from the Red Brigade jump off. They have shotguns and rifles, and they don't hesitate. They just open fire on the group of people boarding the plane. It is a complete massacre.
Congressman Ryan is killed.
He's hit multiple times. He tries to take cover, but they walk up to him and execute him, shooting him more than 20 times.
And the journalists.
Don Harris, the NBC correspondent. Bob Brown, his cameraman. Greg Robinson, a photographer for the San Francisco Examiner. They're all shot and killed. Patricia Parks, one of the defectors who had bravely chosen to leave just an hour before, is also executed.
There is footage of this, isn't there? Bob Brown's camera captured the beginning of it.
It's some of the most terrifying footage ever recorded. Bob Brown kept filming until the moment he was shot and killed. You see the tractor pull up, you see the men raise their guns, and then the camera just drops to the ground.
While this is happening at the airstrip, back in Jonestown, Jones calls everyone back to the pavilion, the final assembly.
And this brings us to what's known as the death tape. The FBI found a 44-minute audio recording of this final meeting. We've both listened to it, and haunting doesn't even begin to cover it.
It's the sound of a massacre happening in real time.
It is. Jones gets on the mic, and his voice is eerily calm, almost soothing. He tells them the congressman is dead, and then he lies to them. He creates this immediate existential threat. He says, the Guyanese army is coming. They're going to parachute in here. They will torture our seniors. They will kill our babies.
So he's creating a scenario where death by his hand is the only merciful option. Death is preferable to what's coming.
He says those exact words. He says, death is 1,000,000 times preferable to 10 more days of this life. He frames it not as a defeat, but as a noble act of dignity, a revolutionary suicide.
But, and this is so important to remember, people pushed back. It wasn't just blind, unanimous acceptance.
No, and we absolutely need to say her name, Christine Miller. She was a 60-year-old woman, and on that tape, you can hear her voice, clear as day, rising out of the crowd. She argues with him. She's surrounded by armed guards, staring down this madman, and she argues for life.
What does she say to him?
She appeals to logic. She says, is it too late for Russia? Can we still go to Russia? She says, I feel like as long as there's life, there's hope. She looks at all the children and she says they deserve to live.
And how does Jones respond?
He talks over her. He uses that calm, patronizing tone. He says, peace, peace, peace. He completely gaslights her. He frames her desire to live as a lack of faith, as a lack of revolutionary consciousness. And then the crowd, whipped up into this frenzy of fear, starts shouting her down. You're disrupting us. Sit down, be quiet.
That just breaks my heart. She's trying to save all of them, and they are shouting her down.
Jones wins the argument through intimidation.
Yeah.
And then the vat is brought out, a large metal tub filled with grape flavor aid, and it's laced with a cocktail of cyanide, Valium, and chloral hydrate.
And he orders the children to be poisoned first.
This is the part that proves, beyond any doubt, that it wasn't suicide. He was a monster, but he was a clever monster. He knew that if the parents drank first, they might have second thoughts, and the children would be left behind as orphans. So he killed the children first to break the parents' will to live.
And the tape captures it. You can hear the crying.
You hear the babies crying, and then, slowly, the crying stops. And Jones is on the microphone the whole time saying things like, die with dignity, lay down your life with dignity, stop this hysterics.
Once the children were gone, the parents had nothing left to live for.
The will to live was completely gone. Odell Rhodes, one of the survivors, described people just wandering around in a daze, waiting their turn to get their cup of poison. But we have to remember the perimeter. The Red Brigade was standing there, circling the pavilion. If you tried to run, you were going to be shot.
So it was death by poison or death by bullet.
That is not a choice. That is not suicide. That is mass murder.
It's a miracle anyone survived at all. How did it happen? You mentioned Odell Rhodes.
There were a few incredible stories. Odell Rhodes, he saw an opening. He told one of the nurses he was going to get a stethoscope for the doctor, and he just kept walking into the dark and hid under a building. An elderly man named Grover Davis laid down in a ditch and just pretended to be dead for hours. Another senior, Hyacinth Thrash, actually slept through the entire thing in her cottage. She was hard of hearing. She woke up the next morning, walked outside, and saw the bodies.
And there was that group with the suitcase, right? A final mission?
Yes. Just before the end, Jones gave a final mission to 3 men, Tim Carter, his brother Mike Carter, and Mike Prokes. He gave them a suitcase containing over $500,000 in cash.
$550,000 in a suitcase.
The temple was rich. They had millions stashed away. Jones told them to run the suitcase to the Soviet embassy in Georgetown.
But they didn't make it.
They took the suitcase, they ran into the jungle as ordered,
Yeah.
and then at some point, they realized the absolute absurdity of it all. They dumped the money and just ran for their lives.
And speaking of money, the will. After the Guyanese army arrived and found the bodies, they found letters on the bodies of Marceline Jones and Carolyn Layton. Who did they leave all the temple's assets to?
The Communist Party of the USSR. There were millions of dollars in offshore bank accounts. In Panama, in the Bahamas. They bequeathed it all to the Soviet Union. It just shows how deep that delusion went. Even in their final moments, they thought they were soldiers for the Soviet cause.
In the aftermath, people just couldn't process this. So, of course, the conspiracy theories started almost immediately. We still hear them today. It was the CIA. It was a government mind control experiment like MKUltra.
It's a comforting thought in a very weird way, isn't it? It's easier to believe that some shadowy, evil government agency used mind control rays than it is to believe that a charismatic preacher from Indiana could talk 900 people into their own deaths.
Was there ever any credible evidence for those theories?
The House Select Committee on Intelligence investigated it thoroughly. They found zero evidence of any CIA involvement. But Jones did use brainwashing techniques. He studied them. He studied North Korean indoctrination methods. He studied Maoist struggle sessions. He didn't need the CIA. He was a self-taught master of psychological manipulation and terror.
What happened to the site? To Jonestown, the place itself?
The jungle took it back very quickly. Locals from Port Kaituma looted the buildings for wood and corrugated tin. Then a fire in the 1980s destroyed most of what was left. For 40 years, it was just vines and overgrowth, completely reclaimed by nature.
But recently, I read something about plans for tourism.
Yeah, this is a very recent and a very controversial development. In late 2024, the Guyanese government announced plans to turn the site into a dark tourism attraction. They want to clear the paths, maybe put up some signs, and open it to visitors.
Selling tickets to a massacre site.
It's causing a lot of pain and anger for the families and survivors. Is it a way to create a memorial and educate people? Or is it just exploitation? It's a very, very tough line to walk.
As we wrap this up, I want to go back to Christine Miller. And I want to go back to those armed guards.
I think that's the most important takeaway from all of this. We look at those horrifying aerial photos of the bodies, face down, often with their arms linked.
Yeah.
And it could look strangely peaceful or orderly,
Mm.
but it wasn't. It was chaos, then terror, then silence.
The question that just haunts me, the one that's impossible to answer, is if the guards hadn't been there, if the crossbows and the rifles hadn't been blocking the only road out.
How many would have walked away? How many would have just run into the jungle? I think the vast majority. I think if they had a real, genuine choice with no guns pointed at them, they would have chosen life. They drank that poison because they looked at the guns and realized they had absolutely nowhere else to go.
So let's just retire the phrase drinking the Kool-Aid. It's not just wrong on the facts. It insults the victims. It erases the coercion. It erases the guns.
Agreed. Remember the 918. Remember they were teachers and nurses and social workers and hundreds of children. They wanted to build a better world, and they were betrayed and murdered by the man they trusted to build it for them.
This has been a heavy one, but thank you for taking this deep dive with us.
Always.
Take care of yourselves out there. We'll see you next time.